Welcome to The Explainer. Right now, we're diving into European exploration when two worlds collided. We're going to look at a singular moment that literally rewired human history. It's the story of two worlds that basically knew nothing about each other and how one specific meeting in 1492 sparked a chain reaction that built the interconnected globe we live in today. Let's get into it.
Okay, to really grasp this, put yourself right there on the beach. Imagine you're standing on the shore of a Caribbean island, it's October 1492, and suddenly, ships appear on the horizon. The people getting off those ships speak a language you've never heard, they're wearing bizarre clothing, carrying weapons you don't recognize, and they've somehow just crossed thousands of miles of open ocean. You don't understand them, they don't understand you. But this incredibly tense, unprecedented face-to-face, it's about to flip the history of the entire world upside down.
So what actually brought those weird ships across a totally unmapped ocean? Well, for centuries, European merchants were completely obsessed with luxury goods from Asia. Spices, silk, things like that. But those traditional overland trade routes were incredibly long and super expensive. They desperately needed a shortcut, a direct, cheaper ocean route. And while Portugal was busy trying to go all the way around Africa, Spain decided to bankroll a massive gamble. They backed an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, who was convinced he could hit Asia just by sailing straight west.
Now, let's look at the timeline here, because it's absolutely crucial to clarify something. Columbus was not the first person to reach the Americas. Indigenous peoples had been thriving there for thousands of years. And honestly, Norse explorers had already touched down in parts of North America centuries earlier. But here's the game changer. When Columbus left Spain in August 1492 and hit the Caribbean in October, it didn't end as just a quick visit. His arrival kicked off an era of continuous, unbroken contact between Europe and the Americas.
And that continuous contact triggered a massive global swap. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange. But this wasn't just, trading a few goods back and forth. This was the total, unbroken movement of plants, animals, people, diseases, technology, and ideas between the Americas and the rest of the globe. It was literally a biological rewiring of the planet.
It's fascinating when you think about how this exchange flowed in both directions. From Europe came things like horses, cattle, pigs, and wheat. Just think about horses for a second. They completely transformed the daily lives of many native peoples, especially on the Great Plains. And heading the other way, the Americas exported maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco. Crops like potatoes were a total game changer. They became this vital, high-calorie food source that ended up feeding and rapidly growing populations all across Europe, Africa, and Asia.
But we have to talk about the invisible, devastating passenger on those ships: disease. Specifically, viruses like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Because indigenous Americans had basically zero prior exposure to these specific bugs, they just didn't have the biological immunity to fight them off. Epidemics spread like wildfire, and tragically, millions of indigenous people died from these diseases in the centuries right after that initial contact.
Which brings us to the conquistadors. That's the Spanish word for conquerors, and it perfectly describes the men Spain sent across the Atlantic. These were heavily armed soldiers, explorers, and basically fortune seekers. Their main goals? Gold, land, power, fame, and spreading Christianity. And that horrifying spread of disease we just talked about? That ultimately paved the way for these relatively small European armies to conquer massive, deeply established civilizations.
Take Hernán Cortés, for example. In 1519, he lands in Mexico with just a few hundred soldiers. Waiting for him is the powerhouse Aztec Empire. The Aztecs controlled a huge chunk of central Mexico, from their massive capital Tenochtitlan. And we're not talking about a small village here. This was a sprawling, complex metropolis, packed with giant temples, incredibly busy markets, and this whole intricate canal system. It was literally one of the largest, most impressive cities on Earth at the time. It completely dwarfed places like London or Paris in both size and engineering.
So how in the world does Cortés, drastically outnumbered, manage to capture this sprawling metropolis by 1521? Well, the Spanish showed up with overwhelming advantages: steel weapons, heavy armor, horses, and firearms, things the Aztecs just hadn't developed. But here's the real kicker. Cortés found indigenous allies who were completely fed up with Aztec rule and wanted to join forces. Combine those crucial local alliances with the devastating diseases tearing through the Aztec population, and the empire just couldn't hold on. Spain actually ended up building what is now Mexico City right on top of the Aztec ruins.
Meanwhile, thousands of miles south, right along the Andes Mountains, a totally different collision was happening. In the early 1530s,
another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, marched into the Inca Empire. And when I say vast territory, I mean vast. This empire stretched for miles and miles through the mountains. It had millions of citizens, connected by thousands of miles of paved roads, complex suspension bridges, massive stone cities, and advanced farming terraces.
But much like the Aztecs, the Inca fell with terrifying speed. See, by the time Pizarro even got there, European diseases had actually outpaced the explorers and completely crippled the population. On top of that, they were right in the middle of a brutal civil war. Pizarro exploited all that chaos and managed to capture the Inca ruler, Atahualpa. And here's the crazy part. The Inca actually paid the ransom. They filled entire rooms with gold and silver. But the Spanish executed Atahualpa anyway. After that, Spanish forces and their local allies just systematically took total control of the whole region.
Now, with Spain grabbing all this new territory, Portugal obviously wanted a piece of the pie. To dodge a massive continent-spanning war, these two powers signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This is wild. They literally just drew an imaginary line down a map of the globe, dividing up any newly claimed lands outside of Europe. Spain got basically everything to the west, and Portugal got the east. That single piece of paper from 1494 is the exact reason why today, Brazil speaks Portuguese, while practically the rest of Central and South America speak Spanish.
Of course, claiming the land is one thing, but managing it is a whole other beast. Spain needed labor to run their lucrative silver mines and massive plantations, so they set up something called the encomienda system. On paper, it sounded like this. Spanish settlers get control over groups of indigenous people to protect them and teach them Christianity. But the reality? It was a nightmare. It turned into a system of incredibly harsh conditions, constant physical abuse, and absolutely brutal forced labor.
And as those indigenous populations continued to tragically plummet, thanks to that horrific combo of violent warfare, the encomienda system, and unchecked disease, the European settlers found themselves facing a severe labor shortage. To replace the workforce that was dying off, they made a systemic and chilling pivot. They increasingly started forcing enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, demanding the grueling labor they needed to keep their expanding empires running.
So this whole era is defined by a really intense duality. On one hand, you have this unprecedented global opportunity. European exploration kicked off an absolute economic boom. Kingdoms got unfathomably rich. Spain expanded its territory on a massive scale, and totally new trade networks sprang up globally. Diets changed forever. New crops caused European populations to skyrocket, while animals like horses completely revolutionized life across the Americas. But we have to look at the other side. That wealth came at a staggering, cataclysmic cost. The destruction was absolute. We're talking millions upon millions dead from disease, the violent collapse of ancient empires, the massive theft of indigenous land, and the horrific rise of the transatlantic slave trade. The human cost and the sheer cultural loss permanently scarred the history of the world.
When you weigh both that booming economic growth and the devastating destruction, you really start to grasp the lasting impact of 1492. The world was suddenly more intertwined than it had ever been. Through trade, migration, conquest, disease, and eventually slavery, Europe, Africa, and the Americas were permanently wired together. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer this vast barrier separating different worlds, it was the very thing connecting them. The ripple effects of that one meeting on a Caribbean beach are just mind-blowing. The consequences of that 1492 connection set the stage for the colonies that eventually became the United States. It literally built the foundation of the modern world we navigate every single day. But it does leave us with a really fascinating, provocative question to chew on. Considering the massive cultural shifts, the tragic loss of life, and that global economic boom, how totally different would our world look today if those three ships had never appeared on the horizon? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.